so far to Revelation chapter 6. Now, as a reminder from where we left off at last week, chapters 4 and 5 discuss the scene in heaven. Of course, up to chapter 3, John had described, or actually should say transcribed, the 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And then immediately, beginning in chapter 4, he was caught up into heaven, and then in chapters 4 and 5, describes the scene that he sees as this myriad of people are gathered around the throne. And as we looked at the various passages that describe these people, you can only come to the conclusion, based upon the description, that this is in fact a description of the church gathered at the throne of God in heaven. But now as we begin chapter 6, the scene shifts completely. Now, while we are seeing some things that are taking place in heaven, the focus is now on what is going to take place on the earth. In fact, the first part of chapter 6 talks about what many people refer to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And actually we'll see that the question, not that it's really a big issue, it's more of merely a minor interpretation, but there's either 5 horses or 5 riders. I tend to believe 4 horses and 5 riders, and we'll see about that here in a moment. But as they are released, what they do affects the scenery on earth. In fact, they are judgments that God is releasing on the earth. So, why is that important? Because if the church is in heaven and these scenes are talking about judgments being released upon the earth, there's two classes of people, I should say, that are the recipients of these judgments. Number 1 are the lost who have rejected God. The second is the nation of Israel, who while at that time are in fact lost because, well, why is Israel lost? Anybody want to take a wild guess? They've not accepted the Messiah. So while they are Israel, and Israel is God's people, the requirement for their salvation is the same as everybody else, isn't it? They have to accept and express faith in the Messiah, which they have not done. So these things are going on, and that's your 2 purposes. And again, I know we've discussed this before, but this is just a reminder that as we begin chapter 6, everything we see from this point forward for the next, I'd say about 12 or 13 chapters, is all to accomplish 2 things: judgment upon the unbelieving and the restoration and redemption of Israel. Now, another point that we need to make as we look into this, and I can't this evening tell you with certainty which of these 2 options that I'm going to give you is true. I can tell you which one I believe to be true, but unfortunately, we can't know for sure. Now, with regard to how Jewish writers recorded history, does anybody remember what is remarkable about their culture and their style of writing that would be different from ours? What's that? Well, that's just their linguistic as far as their writing. Yes, they would write from right to left. But also keep in mind, John wrote this in Greek. And Greek does, in fact, write from left to right. But that isn't the issue. Think more in terms of their culture. Does anybody know? You'll remember why I mentioned this, because you've had this before. Jewish writers, unlike us, did not always tell a story in chronological order. When we tell a story, we tend to start with, this happened first, and then this, and this, and this, and we'll tell it chronologically, don't we? Jewish writers didn't always do that. They tended to tell a story more along the lines of, here's what happened, and here's the important points. There's point 1, point 2, and point 3, or however many points there were, and then they would go back and fill in the details. That's one of the reasons why, as we read the gospel accounts, keeping in mind that each one of the gospel writers is telling it from their own perspective, they also had a tendency to move things around, and that's not a mistake as we would consider it. They're simply telling what to them are the more important points. And that's why sometimes as we read Matthew and compare it with Mark or with Luke, we find events in there, but they're not told in the same order. Good example is some people have believed that there were actually 2 cleansings of the temple, because we find it at the end of one of the Gospels and at the beginning of that. Anybody remember which one? What's that? Yeah. John, on the other hand, tells or provides the cleansing of the temple when? In the beginning. So then some read that and say, well, John told it up front. Well, the synoptic writers, they put the cleansing of the temple at the end. Oh, there must have been 2. No, not at all. You got to keep in mind that John saw that as a more important point, so he put it up front, because he wasn't telling the story chronologically. Now that is an important point, because who wrote Revelation? John did. Now, I've told you all that to bring you to this point. As we begin sharing the various breakings of the seals, now as we read through chapter 6 and continue on, we'll see that God cuts the 7 seals on this scroll, and with each seal, something else happens. And then as we continue on in our study, we find there are 7 bowl, or depending on your translation, will say a vial judgment. And, there's like 3 groups of 7 judgments. If you read it chronologically, it looks like, well, there's 7 seals, and then 7 bowl judgments. You get the idea? But the other possibility is that with the 7 seals, these other judgments actually occurred during the breaking of the seals. Because if you try to read John's book here chronologically, that's one of the reasons why about 2/3 of the way through it, a lot of people just throw up their arms that I can't track what he's talking about, because one point doesn't seem to lead to the next point. And the reason for that is there's a very good possibility John is not telling the story chronologically, that he's giving us the 7 seals up front and then going back and filling in the details. So now, whether he tells this from start to finish, or whether he's doing it, as I just mentioned, topically, we cannot know for sure. My personal opinion is, I think that John skips around a little bit, and there are possibly some things that are, in fact, out of order. But once again, that's just my personal opinion. I'm not going to stand here in front of you and say I know that absolutely for certain, because, well, I wasn't there. What's that? Oh, I'm lying again. All right. Those kids are never going to trust me again. Well, thanks a lot. All right. So let's begin reading chapter 6 here. which starts off with the 7 seals. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius." By the way, a denarius, if you're reading from the King James or one of the others that doesn't use that, a denarius is the Greek equivalent of 1 day's wages. Today, in current wages, $50, $60, $70, something like that. Basically a day's wages. 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. And Hades followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. All right, we're going to stop there and take these 4 horsemen, deal with those, and then we'll move on if we have enough time this evening. I have a feeling that probably this part of the passage will take us most of the evening tonight. All right, now, the first question we have to ask, as Christ breaks these first 4 seals on this scroll, as John is describing this scene, do you think these 4 horsemen and their riders, as he breaks the seal and the living creature declares, "Come forth," are they just coming out from stage left over here somewhere? Or is this scroll of God such a miraculous scroll, keeping in mind who made the scroll? God did. So as he cuts the seals on this, the image here is actually that literally as God unrolls the scroll out from the scroll itself. How many of you seen, I don't remember, it's an ad on TV for a cell phone. I don't remember which one. But this lady's walking down the street, and she takes out her cell phone, and as she starts, punching keys on the cell phone, all of a sudden you see these, images just pouring out from the cell phone, and she's just, "Oh, wow, look at that." Any of you seen that ad? A few of you. Some of you are just going, "No." Okay, trust me, there's an ad on TV. That's what happens. She punches keys on her cell phone, and as she looks up, all of these images just come flying out in 3D, out from her cell phone. That's kind of the image that's being described here as God unrolls the scroll, and the living creature, which again I think is a cherub, declares, "Come forth," that from the pages of the scroll itself out come these beings. Now, for us, we would think that, well, that kind of thing doesn't happen. You can't do that. Keeping in mind, who are we talking that's in charge here that's unrolling this scroll? Can a beast come forth out of a scroll that God created? Yeah, he can do it. If God wants to, that's what's happening. And that's the vision that John is describing here, is that literally as God is unrolling it, out comes these judgments. So that's the vision that John is seeing. Because notice what John does not say. And as we read through this, notice John is very detailed about what he says. He doesn't just give us some general scenery. John tells us a lot of details about the things that he sees, doesn't he? Notice he does not say, well, from over here to the left, or from behind the throne, or, from over here somewhere in the cloud, here come. he's describing that Jesus is breaking the scroll and the seal. The cherub yells, pronounces, "Come forth," and there it is. So the image is that these things are miraculously occurring as Jesus is unrolling that scroll. All right. Now, number 1, which is the second verse, says, "Behold a white horse." Now, what does a white horse symbolize? White symbolizes purity, but not necessarily a white horse. What's that? You're on the right track. Excuse me. When Jesus comes in the second coming, what are we told he's going to be riding? A white horse. Now, is this Jesus? No. And I'll tell you 2 reasons why we know this is not Jesus. Who's holding the scroll? Jesus. And we're talking about some rider on a white horse coming forth from the scroll as he's breaking the seals and unrolling it. Second thing is, look what this rider on this horse does. This is a judgment. This is, brings forth, to conquer. This is not Jesus. If anything, this would be a pretender. Now, what has Satan, from the time he became Satan, what has he wanted to do? He wants to be God. And Jesus himself declared that the devil is a liar and a deceiver, isn't he? And he would want nothing more than for people to worship him and to think that he is God. So if Jesus comes forth in the second coming on a white horse, here we see as this thing comes forth from the pages of the scroll, or actually should say the scroll. I think pages because we're thinking of books, but this is not a book, it's a scroll. But anyway, good possibility that this is Satan himself. Other thing, and another reason we know that this is not Jesus, it says a crown was given to him. Now in the Greek, remember there's 2 words for crown in the Greek language. The first one word in Greek is where we get the word diadem. What is a diadem? In fact, we have a hymn about this. Anybody remember the hymn? What's that? Yeah, diadem is a crown of royalty. And in the Bible, it only describes one person as having a crown of royalty. You want to guess who that is? Absolutely. But this word that says a crown was given to him is a Stephanos, from where we get the name Stephen. A Stephanos is a victor's crown. In fact, when we are told that we will each at judgment be given a crown, we are not given a diadem. Guess what we get? A Stephanos, because we have been victorious over what? Sin and death. Well, the crown that's given to this person is a Stephanos, a victor's crown, not a diadem. If it had been Jesus, it would have been a diadem. All right. So we have someone on a white horse, and by the way, the other thing that a white horse symbolizes is an approaching army, a general, someone who, in fact, remember in Middle Eastern culture, centuries ago, I'm sure they don't do this now, but centuries ago, when the guard would be up on the lookout up on the city tower, he would be scanning the horizon looking for the approaching enemy. If he saw a dust cloud off in the distance and watched it, as they got close enough that he could make out the approaching army, he would look for one thing. Whoever was leading that army, were they coming on a donkey or a horse? If they came on a donkey, it meant they were coming in peace, and that was the ambassador leading the army to come and establish diplomatic relations. And in fact, if they attacked with an ambassador leading the crowd, it would have been considered the the utmost in treachery. And Middle Eastern people believe, even with your enemy, they believed in hospitality. They just would not do that. Would be totally against their nature. On the other hand, if they saw that the approaching army was led by someone on, guess what? A white horse. It's close the city gates, grab your weapons, the army is approaching. Well, here we see this guy is riding on a white horse. He's bringing war. However, notice it says the rider had a bow. No arrows. Where's his ammunition? It's like having a rifle with no bullets. You know, I can shake my rifle at you all day long, but if I got no bullets in it, guess what? I'm not doing nothing. I ain't doing nothing. That's what you got here. A conqueror with a bow and no ammunition, no arrows, no arrows. I'll get my tongues. You done got me talking like, it's all your fault. All right. So what's the point of this? This conqueror is going to take over without a shot being fired. Guess what's going on in the world today? Now, I know everybody says that communism is dead. Don't tell the communist Chinese that. Don't tell the North Koreans that. And don't tell Putin that. While Soviet Russia is gone, you ask any avowed communist in Russia, this is just the calm before the storm. They're not done. Tell you a little bit about a little lesson in political science here. If I present you with an idea, and when I say ideas, I mean political systems. If I present you with an idea, a political system, if you will, we call that a thesis. Now, what political and economic system do we in this country and the free world live by? Say that louder, man. Well, capitalism. On the other hand, we have another system that has risen in the world that is the absolute, guess what we call that? Antithesis. The antithesis of our thesis. And somebody said it louder, so what? Larry, I heard your voice. Socialism. By the way, that is one of the reasons why socialism in this country is unthinkable, because it is the exact opposite of everything we stand for. But it is the antithesis. However, when you take those two competing systems, sooner or later, as they compete for prevalence, a new system will arise. Guess what we refer to it as? Anybody want to guess? It is the synthesis. This is where the Russians right now, they figure we're somewhere right in here. That's why they're not too concerned that Soviet Russia has gone away, because we're the thesis. They have presented the world with the antithesis, and now we're transitioning from here to here. Something new is on the horizon. Now, don't anybody ask me what the new thing is, because I don't know yet. But that's the way they look at it. And I tell you that for this reason. Soviet Union as a nation may be gone, but their economic system and their way of life is anything but gone. And one of the reasons we know that is because, go back to this little book I got here, every time we see something major happening in the world with regard to an attack on Israel in yet our future, excuse me, guess where it comes from? The enemy out of the north. And if you draw a line from Jerusalem northward, remember what city it goes to? Moscow. Folks, they're not done yet. All right, now, all that to bring back to this passage of Scripture. This rider on a white horse is going to conquer the world without a shot being fired. And if you read anything from Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, who of course were the authors of communism, they will tell you, or would have, they're both dead now, they would tell you that the way that you defeat a country is from the inside out. You don't go to war with a country. You defeat them from the inside out without a shot being fired. Do you think that's going on today? You better believe it is. And in our nation, you know what one single event that we can point back to that was the beginning of the war? I'll give you a hint, it was a Supreme Court decision. You're on the right track when Jesus got kicked out of the public school. Because when that happened, now what is being taught to students in school systems today? There is no God. We evolved. And if you got no God, no Creator, who are we worshiping? Exactly. There you go. All that to usher in the next stage of where our world is going. When that rider on the white horse goes forth, he will conquer the world without a shot being fired. In all likelihood, the identity of the rider on that white horse is the Antichrist. Now, after he does what he does and gathers the world, basically rallies the world around him to his leadership, the next thing happens. Verse 3. He opened the second seal. I heard the second living creature say, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Guess what the red rider is here? War. Because the first guy has conquered without a shot being fired. But what happens every time there's a major change in political systems and new leaders emerge? There's going to be war. Right now there's, I'd say, a better than even likelihood that the Middle East is going to be heavily involved in any future wars that go on. But red is the symbolism of war. In Greek mythology, who is the god of war? Mars. Why do you think they called Mars Mars? Because it's the red planet. Red has been the symbolism of war for hundreds of years. This isn't anything new. But on the tail end of war, guess what else we have? And by the way, we know this is war because guess what this rider was given? A sword. He's got his ammunition. You don't need arrows when you got a sword, do you? This rider is bringing war to the world. Verse 5, when he opened the third seal, the third living creature says, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures, saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Don't harm the oil and wine." All right, now, if a denarius, how many are reading from the King James? What does the King James use there where my translation says, the Greek denarius? What does yours say? Penny. Which is not totally off because 2,000 years ago, a penny was worth how much? You could work all day long for a penny. Penny was worth something. Nowadays, you walk down the street, people drop pennies, they don't even take the time to reach down and pick them up. You burn more calories than what that penny's worth picking it up. Although I admit, I'll still pick it up. How many of us pick up pennies? You guys in the back pick up pennies?
If their heads up.
Yeah. Most young people don't bother. Us old folks, we pick up pennies because to us, even though our heads tell us that penny's not worth much, we still remember a time when a loaf of bread only cost 35 cents. That penny was actually worth something. Well, back it up another 2,000 years, that penny was a day's wage. That's why the King James uses the word penny, because that was a day's wage, and that's what essentially is being described here. Now, here's why this is important. How many of you have ever paid a day's wage for a quart of wheat or a quart of flour? How much is a quart? You ladies, because I don't know, maybe some of you men do. I don't do the shopping that much. How much does a quart of wheat cost these days? 5 or 10 bucks? $5, okay. That's not even close. Make more money than that. If you're earning minimum wage, you make that in about 10 or 15 minutes. Well, now we're talking about this quart of wheat. Takes you all day to earn enough money to buy that. A quart of barley, day's wage. Why don't you want to harm the oil and wine? Because it's priceless. Absolutely priceless. What is this describing? Famine. What happens every time you have an all-out war? Famine. So now, going right after this horse that brings war, famine is on the land. Just goes without saying. And God's going to see to it that it happens because it's one of His judgments. Then when He opens the fourth seal, the fourth living creature says, "Come." Says, "I looked, and behold, a pale horse." By the way, that word pale is the same Greek word that in our language we get the word chlorine from, or Clorox. It's chloros, which is... How many have ever seen chlorine gas before? Any of you? It has this pale, sickly, greenish hue to it. I won't ask any of you how many of you ever inhaled it, because if you had, you wouldn't be here. It's deadly poisonous. How many of you have ever seen or maybe, I hope you've never seen it, maybe you've seen pictures of just this pale, sickly color that a dead body gets after it's been dead for a while. A starving person that just loses all color in there. That's what this word means. It's not just a pale horse. He is a sickly, emaciated chlorine, this pale, sickly green hue of a horse. Because you've got war, then behind the war you've got famine, and what happens after that? Death. Pale horse, and its rider's name is none other than Death. Now here's where the question is. It says, and Hades, or if you look at the King James, it says hell. Basically the word there simply means the place of the dead. Death and hell, or death and Hades. Death, basically the place where dead people go. Followed with him. Now here's the question, and it's really just an interesting point for you to visualize. Which of these that John meant isn't really that important. Was John saying there was a fifth horse, or is he saying that on this fourth horse he had two riders, death in the front and hell riding, back saddle behind him? My personal opinion is, since there's no mention of a fifth horse, I think this fourth horse had two riders on there. I don't think hell was chasing after him on foot. So they're riding tandem with death and hell together. John's describing a picture here that definitely would indicate not a healthy situation. And in fact, look what happens. It says, they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill, notice here, with sword, there's your red rider, and with famine, there's your black rider, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. How many people you think that we have in the world today? Somebody give me an estimate, ballpark figure. About 7 billion. All right, now out of that, if the rapture has occurred, how many Christians you think there are in the world today? Too few. Let's be liberal about it. Let's say there's 1 billion Christians in the world today. I don't think there are, but let's be kind about it. Between now and then, let's say there's going to be 1 billion Christians. So if there's 7 billion, take away 1 billion, you got 6 left. Keeping in mind the world's population is continuing to grow, and between now and the time the rapture and this time tribulation actually starts, could be 8 billion. But somewhere in there, and these first 4 judgments, these first 4 seals are going to kill off 1/4 of the world's population. You realize how many people that is? That's 1.5 billion people. World War II will pale in comparison to the death that this is going to bring. World War II, people talked about how many millions died. We're not talking millions here. We're talking billions. At least 1.5 billion people, possibly more, that are going to die during this period of time. Now, what happens when you have dead bodies all over the place? Because how well, if you've got that many people dying at one time, the morticians can only keep up with just so many of them. There's going to be mass graves, people just digging trenches and just throwing them in. Do you think the world's going to be able to keep up with that many dead bodies? I doubt it. What happens when you got dead bodies exposed? More disease. The world is going to stink, and it will reek of disease. By the way, look, if you will, in Leviticus chapter 26. let's see here. What's that? Okay, I lost my place. I'm looking for the specific passage. Or maybe it was 20. Oh, no wonder I can't find it. I'm looking in Deuteronomy. That would be a problem. Yeah. It's hard to find a passage in Leviticus when you're looking in Deuteronomy. Yeah. Leviticus 26, beginning in verse 22. And I will let loose the wild beast against you, which shall bereave you of your children, and destroy your livestock, and make you few in number, so that your road shall be deserted. And if by this discipline you are not turned to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will also walk contrary to you, and I myself will strike you sevenfold for your sins, and I will bring a sword upon you. Thou execute vengeance for the covenant. And if you gather within your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. When I break your supply of bread. Notice this. War, famine, pestilence, and wild beast. God is executing upon Israel the very thing He promised all the way back in the law He gave to Moses. Remember the two things that God is accomplishing during the tribulation period? He is pouring out judgment upon the earth, and He is bringing judgment upon Israel for Israel's disobedience. So these four things that are going on with this fourth rider, or actually the last three riders here, war, famine, pestilence, the wild beast, these are not arbitrary. This is a fulfillment of the law in Leviticus poured out upon disbelieving Israel. It's a completion of the covenant. Again, these four are not, this is not arbitrary. God's fulfilling exactly what He said He would do if Israel was disobedient and turned against Him. However, every time God punished Israel, what was the anticipated result? Why did He punish them? Should have been two reasons. What's that? That's the first reason, simply because punishment for disobedience. But what would be the second reason? To bring them back, to redeem them. That is what will happen here. God will judge them for their disobedience, but before the tribulation is over, it will accomplish what God wants to accomplish, that Israel will turn back and be redeemed. All right. Well, that's as far as we're going to get this evening. The four horsemen of the apocalypse.